Good morning, everyone from Denver, Colorado, and happy local time to you across the world. Welcome back for our last global classroom before the elections here in the US. As a reminder, we will not be meeting next week for that election, and also we will be switching to daylight savings time here in the US. So our time zone may change for you for next time we meet in 2 weeks. We'll send all the details out about that in the weekly email. But this morning, it's a very good time for us to welcome an MDP alum, specifically the MPA-DP from Columbia University, Ms. Liz Benferhat. Liz Moyer Benferhat is a development practitioner, facilitator, writer, and healing-centered coach dedicated to the subtle interplay between how inner transformation feeds the outer transformation needed in the world. In 2018, she launched We Heal for All to help change makers process the many normal feelings that come with working on behalf of complex global and social issues. Through workshops and online programs, she brings healing-centered science and tools to help people thrive in their work and form a healthier relationship with our changing world. Her debut book will be published in 2025, called Collective Healing for Our Complex Times, How to Be in Relationship with the World's Pain. As a development practitioner, Liz has worked with a range of organizations, from grassroots development in Nairobi to social enterprises focused on time banks in Colombia, to SDG policy through the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network. Most recently, Liz led monitoring and evaluation work for the Presencing Institute's SDG Leadership Labs with senior UN officials, developing and implementing a framework for measuring transformative leadership. She graduated from Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs with a master's in development practice back in 2015. With that, Liz, we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you for joining us
today. Yeah, thank you so much for having me. Hi, everyone. It's just so nice to be here. Honestly, it's a bit of a homecoming knowing that I'm amongst soon-to-be friends, I hope, of other fellow MDP and development practitioners and MDD programs. So thank you so much, Mark, and the Global Classroom for having me. So today's lecture and the conversation that I hope to have with you all today is around inner development for sustainable development. This question of what inner capacities do we need to be effective leaders, effective change makers in our complex, fast-changing world. And what I hope to do is to introduce you to this niche yet growing field of researchers and practitioners who are attempting to answer that question. It is a field of research and practice embedded within this larger field of capacity development for leadership and practitioners. And it's a set of conversations and tools that are also being extended to the more general population these days, as more and more people are aware and have a newfound relationship with the world and the challenges that the world faces. So just supporting people, both practitioners, leaders, as well as everyday people. Let me see here, I think this should be perfect. So what we'll do today is I want to introduce you to what this field of practice is and why it's needed. And then I want to take a look at three, we can think of it as target populations or three target groups to really see and look at what this field of practice looks like on the ground. I find, especially with conversations around inner development or inner capacities, inner skills, just the inner world, right? We're talking about things that are subjective. We're talking about things that have, cultural diversity to them. We're talking about things that have a degree of ambiguity to them. So really grounding our conversation today in real world examples of what this looks like in practice, I hope will give some texture and some form to something that can sometimes feel a bit ambiguous. So we'll look at leadership development, and we'll look at specific case studies within these target groups too. So just what's the conversation within the leadership development space on this intercapacity development? What does it look like for students within higher education? And then what does it look like for the general public? So starting with this question of need, what are we talking about here and why are we talking about it? Like I mentioned, there is this larger field of practice that really asks, how do we equip people to be effective change agents? And often this is traditionally thought about in terms of technical skills, right? And maybe you see it in your program as well, right? We need to take macroeconomics, we need quantitative analysis, we need tools like cost benefit analysis, logical framework analysis, evaluation skills, operations management, budgeting, strategy, proposal writing, right? These are all very technical and tangible skill sets that help us work in the nonprofit settings, work within the public sector, and really design and implement programs and policies for sustainable development. But then there's another category of capacities that, for the purpose of our time here together, I want to refer to as inner capacities. Now, often these are thought of as soft skills, quote unquote. I personally think I don't personally love that that phrase, because I feel like it creates a little bit of a hierarchy between different types of skills. But again, these are skills that are often more subtle and subjective, but are equally important, especially in this day and age when we are talking about systems change. So leadership that's aimed at systems change, which requires, looking from multiple perspectives, for instance, or coordinating across diverse actors and sectors and cultures. That involves collaboration, that involves empathy. So this field of intercapacity development is rooted in leadership development in psychology, organizational change, social movement theories. And the way that I personally think about this, this field of research and practice is really expanding the whole systems approach that is now the mainstream paradigm within sustainable development and international development, right? We take a whole systems approach to the way that we look at social and environmental and economic justice issues, and take the whole system into account when designing solutions and interventions and approaches to solving things. So really expanding that whole systems approach to include the full development of us as practitioners. So complexity is something that's talked about a lot within the sustainable development space. And often it's talked about within the terms of intellectual complexity, right? Having the ability to zoom out and map the interconnectedness between the different sectors, the different stakeholders, the different dimensions of any given issue that we are seeking to address. But there's also another dimension of complexity that I want to bring in here, and it's that we live in very, very complicated times. And the work that we're doing seeks to address really complicated issues, issues that have inevitable uncertainty, and the times that we live in more generally have inevitable uncertainty to it, issues that in many cases have existential consequences to it, or at least existential dimensions to it. And so naturally, for the majority of us, our inner worlds are affected, right? Our inner worlds are involved in some kind of way, shape, or form. So, in terms of what this does or the effects of this, and I may be reading or sharing these with you, and perhaps you're all too familiar to that for them, or I'm curious, I don't want to make any assumptions, but this leads to a lot of people experiencing burnout, chronic fatigue, compassion fatigue, people who will feel sometimes disillusioned by just the complexity and the complicated nature of the times that we live in, feeling stuck or even hopeless, overwhelmed. I know, especially for the general population, everyday people, there's a lot of times this feeling of like, what do we even do? You know, I know so much, but how do I even translate into that into action? And I think as development practitioners in particular, we sit at an interesting point of managing complexity of both breakdown of things that no longer are of service, but also we are managing opportunity. You know, I find that a lot of the development practitioners that I work with really hold and manage and balance the multitudes within all of that. So, you know, as leaders, we need to be able to engage with uncertainty, be adaptive and agile, grounded in you know, work from a place of integrity. So often those of us who enter into this work, we do it because of our own personal vision of what's needed in the world, as well as our own values, right? Deeply held beliefs about what's right and wrong and wanting to be of service. So our hearts are naturally involved. And then collectively, if we look at the sustainable development goals, you know, we know they're not a legally binding framework, right? They're a normative framework. And norms are based on shared values, right? And, you know, and we're talking about normative competences or, you know, normative frameworks. These are frameworks that are based on values, on how the world should be, quote unquote. And so then translating that into norms for the international community. So again, there's this dimension of the internal world, right, of collective visions and collective values. So just to further ground and kind of do some table setting here at the beginning of the presentation, I want to introduce you to this framework. It's called the Inner Development Goals Framework. And perhaps you took a look at it before our time here together. It was one of the readings that I shared beforehand. And, you know, I think that this is an interesting framework to look at, not because I think that this framework has it all right, or, you know, we can, you know, all right, we did it, y'all. We figured out what the inner shifts and the inner capacities that we need to achieve the sustainable development goals are. But it's an initiative that seeks to answer that. And I think that the way that the organization goes about it too really reflects and embodies both a co-creative approach to this, meaning they brought together thousands of scientists and experts and HR specialists, sustainability professionals to develop out this framework. And they really approach it as this living, breathing, you know, framework that will continue to evolve with time. But again, you know, just in the spirit of grounding what we're talking about here, these are some examples of what inner capacities can look like. You know, they tend to be pro-social in nature. And I actually even just had a little glimpse at some of the one of the questions that may be floated later when we get into the Q&A section. But really contextualizing, you know, what does you know, integrity and authenticity mean within different cultural contexts? So how like, does this align with what's pro-social within different cultural contexts, which I would argue is really the invitation for each cultural setting to get to determine. And, you know, these, another way that I think about what this framework has done is also point to certain inner capacities that tend to be lacking in some way, shape, or form within our current cultural makeup or these different cultural settings. So that's, I think, another way that we could think about the outcome of this framework. But, you know, their goal was really, you know, looking at the goals that we have as a sustainable development community and seeing the lack of progress or just the amount of work that still needs to be done, and making the case that part of what's missing is this inner capacity development to support and really help our external approaches flourish. So let's get into some more concrete examples here. So starting with leadership development. So within the conversation of what types of skills do leaders need to be effective in this day and age, especially within the sustainable development space, there's a term called systems leadership. And systems leadership or systems leaders are, systems leadership is a set of skills that helps leaders enact systems change, right? So there's different definitions of systems leadership, and I'm going to share a couple with you here. But at the core, a lot of them share the same, have overlap around understanding the importance of collaboration within it, collaborative leadership. So enabling trust building, empowered action across stakeholders, working towards a common goal. There's a collective dimension to it, or community building, so coalition building, advocacy, mobilizing across stakeholders, both within and outside of organizations, and then also understanding the system within which that they operate. This is what I wanted to do with this slide. This is an article. These are some lines from an article from the International Institute for Sustainable Development. This article is titled "The Essence of Leadership for Achieving the SDGs." And I thought that they did a really nice job of speaking to just the systemic nature, or let's put it this way, the type of leadership that's needed that is more systemic in nature, as opposed to and moving away from more linear models of leadership. And I'll read these and hopefully it'll clarify what I was just saying there. So rather than providing a solution, rather than a leader being the person who is meant to deliver, be the sole person to deliver a solution to a problem, instead the role of a systems leader is to create opportunities for people to come together and generate their own answers, right? Their role, systems leaders' role, is to help people to develop a relationship with uncertainty and chaos and emergence. This article goes on to say that it requires an inner process, right, where the leader must first be grounded in their own understanding of themselves, right, have the self-awareness about who they are, the blind spots that they come in with, and then also an understanding of a relational view of the world, right? How do different components of the system that I'm working with, how do different organizations, how do different stakeholders relate to each other within this system? And the article also goes on to say, just to give us a definition of what reflection is, and that it's a process of understanding one's own skills, knowledge, and values within the context of community groups. These kind of reflective processes then set up an opportunity for feedback loops and cycles of growth and change. So again, moving away from from a more top-down approach to leadership into a more systems approach to leadership, where there is opportunity for feedback loops. And so let's get into a case example of what this looks like. And this is a program that I worked on for 2 years. It's called the SDG Leadership Labs. And it was offered in partnership with the Presencing Institute and the UN Developmental Coordination Office. Before I go into the details about this program, I want to give a little bit of background, and these were also some readings that were shared beforehand, so perhaps you had an opportunity to dive into them. But, in alignment with the adoption of the SDGs and the UN's shift or paradigm shift towards a more systems-oriented way, or even a more integrated approach to development, understanding that we can't keep working in silos, we have to work across sectors. There have been a set of leadership reforms that were adopted and developed in 2017 to match in parallel these shifts at a structural level. And this UN system leadership framework not only has hoped to better define what this new way of working together as a UN system is, but also to establish a common UN leadership culture that really can support the SDGs and are aligned with achieving the SDGs. So it's about aligning its staff capacities towards transformative leadership and towards this more systems leadership approach, and then by doing so, also ushering in broader culture shifts within the UN system. So within these changes within the UN system, right, that the SDGs so, embody and demonstrate so well, this move towards an integrated approach, a whole systems approach to development practice. There have also been structural changes within the UN to implement this new paradigm shift or this new way of going about development work. And one of those structure changes is the development of coordinating bodies at the country level called country teams. And so country teams have been developed both for the development sector within each country, and those are called UN country teams, as well as within the humanitarian sector within each country. So these country teams are essentially a coordinating body that brings together all of the different agencies that operate within that country, right? It's UNICEF, it's UNDP, it's OCHA, right? It's an opportunity, it's a coordinating body that brings them together to be able to work together and have shared goals in alignment with the government and in conjunction with other civil society organizations. These coordinating bodies are headed by a resident coordinator. And the resident coordinator has a leadership profile that really reflects that UN systems leadership framework that I was sharing earlier. So I wanted to just share this with you briefly, but again, within making the case for the need for intercapacity development, we can see that within this leadership profile, there's things like inclusion, integrity, humility, the ability to facilitate co-creation. So again, thinking back to that IISD article's description of what systems leadership is, not about just having the answers, delivering the answers, but creating the conditions for groups of people to come together and co-create and come up with and generate answers together. So yeah, so just a little bit there. So what the labs did is they created an opportunity for these UN country teams to step out of their busy schedules, step out of their day-to-day lives, step out of the bureaucracy that is really the standard way that these country teams are used to working with each other, and create an opportunity for these members to come together as peers, as colleagues and partners, and really start to develop, I want to develop the cultural software to meet the structural hardware shifts, if that makes sense. So, the UN system has been operating for decades in a specific way. When structural changes happen, like the formation of a new coordinating body, the culture just doesn't automatically shift to meet that, right? The software doesn't necessarily automatically shift to meet that. Instead, there needs to be intentionally curated space facilitated in a way to help upgrade that software, if you will. And so that's what these labs sought to do. As an opportunity to come together and give that country team an opportunity to refine and reconnect with a collective vision for the work that they do together, outside of the strategic documents that they have that already outlines goals and implementation schedules, but really connecting to a collective vision. The way that the Presencing Institute often talks about their work, and I'll share a bit more about their model here in a second, is that they help the system to see and sense itself. They help the system to see and sense itself. And while maybe that sounds a little like, what are you talking about? Maybe at first, what it really means is bringing people together, especially when it comes to a large network like this, such as the case of this country team, and giving people the tools and the opportunity to be able to hear from each other and therefore understand and see parts of the system that perhaps were outside of their awareness previously, or perhaps so they didn't have opportunities to be able to see as clearly or understand as in depth as they had previously. This is especially important for stakeholders within civil society who often are very much unheard within this system. So really an opportunity, or within these coordinating teams. So really an opportunity to bring people together. So a little bit about just one more thing I want to share about these labs, and I'm happy to talk about this in more depth, maybe during the Q&A section if people are of interest. But we saw really interesting results from these labs, especially when it comes to senior UN leaders being involved. We weren't sure what how receptive people would be, or and it was a lot about customizing tools for the local context, and really the co-creative nature of coming together with a team of people within the country team to really design these labs in a way that do make sense and are of service and helpful to these country teams and the country and their needs at this point in their development. But I wanted to share this slide with you here. So the Presencing Institute has a method of working with change makers that they call Theory U. And it's been developed over 20 years of action research and applying the method. It was developed within MIT's, I believe it was their leadership development program, but it blends systems thinking and innovation, leading change. And at the heart of Theory U is really this question, this understanding that the success of what we do depends on the inner place from which we operate. And so really my intention with sharing this slide was to show you that there are very concrete tools that are used within this methodology. There are different exercises and techniques that help to deepen a person's capacity for listening. The iceberg model, for instance, is about looking below the surface of the structures to see what other factors are driving the collective outcomes that we see. I think so often intercapacity development can sound a bit vague, and so I wanted to share this slide just to make the point that there are concrete tools that are out there and that have been developed and continue to be developed over many, many years of development of research. All right, let's move on to higher education, which I hope is an interesting one for you all, just being in a master's program right now. So within the UN system and within the larger field of sustainable development, there is a broad category of conversation and practice and research called education for sustainable development. And it's really what it's really what I was sharing with you earlier. What are the capacities, the skills, the knowledge that students need to be equipped to address the intractable problems that we face as a world, to be effective change makers, to create a better future for everyone. Within this research article, White et al., this is called Key Competences in Sustainability, a reference framework for academic program development. These authors identified 5 key competencies that are necessary for students to learn within the sustainable development programs, and those are systems thinking, anticipatory competences, so being able to anticipate what's coming down the line or look into the future, think about the future, normative competences, strategic competences, and then interpersonal competence. I would make the argument that the inner capacities have overlap with that normative competence category as well as interpersonal. There's also a set of authors and researchers and practitioners who are having conversations within the sustainable development space about transformative learning. And transformative learning is this idea that anytime anyone learns something new, there is both an opportunity to, but also it's naturally happening on its own, where that person's worldview is coming into light or it has an opportunity to shift. Right. And so our worldviews, we all have them, right? And they tend to be, and they're the lens through which we look at the world and understand the world. They're often highly, highly subconscious or unconscious because they're so deeply baked within us, but they're how we make sense of information that we take in. And so this naturally happens when anyone learns something new, right? They take in information and then that information naturally sees if it has a place to sit and fit within that person's worldview. And if it doesn't, then the worldview gets shaken up a bit, right? And it naturally changes. There are also ways, and there are educators who are proponents of actively facilitating that process with students as well. And so from this article, the authors, Lotz Sistik et al., this one's called Transformative, Transgressive Social Learning, Rethinking Higher Education Pedagogy in Times of Systemic Global Dysfunction, had some really interesting ways of framing the need and actually what it looks like in practice of more transformative learning. So I pulled out a couple of those that I just thought were interesting. The one differentiation that they make is transformation versus optimization. So optimization being, learning how to do what we already do, but just doing it better, as opposed to transformation being transitioning towards doing better things differently. So that paradigm shift and that differentiation there. I talk about the blurring of boundaries and lines between formal and informal modes of learning, how that's needed and how that supports more transformative learning processes. And then again, this theme of helping students to cultivate maturity around how to live and negotiate and work in a world full of contradictions and paradoxes, uncertainty, and fairness and unfairness. So a specific example that I want to share, and this comes from Dr. Angel Acosta, and he was a student, a PhD student, and now is a faculty member at Columbia University's Teachers College. And Teachers College really supports the development of educators, specifically educational professionals. And so this program here, it's called Contemplating 400 Years of Inequality. And it's a mindfulness-based learning experience where participants come together and have an opportunity to do what they call a contemplative walk through history, right? And contemplation as a practice is brought in order to help participants process, and this is specifically within the United States collective past as it relates to racial and socioeconomic inequality, the way that those structures of inequality still exist today. And, there's been a lot of this need for conversation and dialogue within the United States and within the world more globally around the history of inequality and structural inequality, racial inequality within America and within the world at large. What this program seeks to do is to move away from just information sharing, from just knowledge sharing or knowledge acquisition, and actually move towards more mindful listening, right? Really taking in this information at other layers besides just the kind of data processing part of our minds, but creating the conditions within a group setting for people to process the information at deeper levels, in order to move towards, cultivate more compassion, more understanding, and walk away with a more embodied understanding of this issue that then they can bring forward with them in the way that they teach, the way that they facilitate, the way that they're leaders within their communities. So this is, I think, a great example of bringing in that formal, informal mix that those authors talked about. All right, last but not least, general public. And this is where I want to share a bit with you about the work that I do. So as Mark shared in my introduction, over the last 6 years, 7 years, I've been working with change makers, which I define as both activists and traditional change makers, but also anyone who is consciously aware that the way that they live their life impacts the world around them. So I work with a lot of teachers, I work with a lot of yogis, I work with people of all different stripes, and I work with parents, I work with a lot of different people. And what I do is I help them process the many normal feelings that come with being alive and attuned to the changes that are going on in the world these days. And especially in this age of information that we live in, this age of awareness that we live in, there is a growing need for this. We see throughout society a rise in collective anxiety and confusion about the state of things, the state of the world. This, I believe, is part of the reason why we see such a rise in polarization and unrest. Like I shared at the beginning, I find I come across a lot of people, I work with a lot of people who feel a real sense of overwhelm and dread, or even a sense of hopelessness. And what social scientists have pointed to over the last, and it really started within research on the shifts of modernity within Western Europe, is that rises in collective anxiety are often attributed to or seen as an indication of shifts in social order, shifts of collective consciousness taking place. So my theory of change around why it is important or helpful or necessary to provide people with tools and support to process what they're feeling and process their experiences in their new relationship with the world is both because it helps people stay sane. It helps them feel better, which is no small feat. But more importantly, it helps them continue to engage and show up to the changes that are going on in the world. It helps people to figure out how best to be of service in the unique way that they feel called to and that they're interested in being of service, whether that's in their kids' school or their local community or within political participation, or if it's in bringing new changes to their workplace, or if it's related to their own identity, their own sense of self, their relationships, how they perceive and go about their professional lives and what it means to be successful. So on that personal level, those are the reasons why, and the theory of change behind why I do this work. And then at the collective level, my theory of change around this is also that, the shifts that are going on, or the experiences that are going on for people on the ground are directly connected to the shifts that are going on within our collective world. So we need tools to help people, the collective consciousness. I'm pulling from the French sociologist Emile Durkheim's definition of this. This is where, as a society, shared values and norms and beliefs and morals and worldviews, perceptions of the world live, if you will, within society. It's almost like society's sense of self. And so what we know from the field of psychology and neuroscience is that our emotions are tied to our values. Our emotions, one way that I love hearing it said is emotions reveal us to ourselves, right? They show us what's important to us, what our needs are. And we have this really awesome, set of research and practice that really helps us. And it's called healing centered sciences. So within the field of clinical psychology, healing centered practices are ones that use emotions as the main entry point for transformation, as opposed to a person's thoughts or a person's behaviors. And so, yeah, what this field of practice and research really shows us and tells us and informs us and equips us with is having a better, deeper understanding of what emotions are, how they work within the mind and the body, neurobiologically speaking, as well as their evolutionary purpose, right? Emotions are baked into us from eons of our evolution as a species. And so there's an intelligence to them that we can harness and tap into. So circling back to my theory of change at the collective level, that by supporting people to process what they're feeling, they themselves can unearth or tap into the shifts in values, the shift in norms, the shifts in worldviews that are happening for them, and then put that into practice and support culture change in that way. So yeah, so what I do is I do workshops, I do circles, I do retreats, and I have a specific model that uses healing-centered practices to support people to process what they're experiencing. And it's no small feat in our highly polarized world to bring people together and set up the conditions that are supportive in the best as possible. And I actually I'm intentionally not using the word safety here because safety is such a subjective experience. And anyways, I could go down a whole rabbit hole around that. But the intention here, or the larger process, oh, it looks like this slide didn't come in, but it's around, no, it didn't come in, but it's around giving people an opportunity to process and digest the information that they take in from the world, unearth wisdom within it, or receive guidance, receive new insights about themselves, about the role that they are called to play in the world, and then going back out into the world and putting that into practice, experimenting with that, applying that into their life, and then coming back around, right? Coming back again to now process and digest what they just experienced, what they just took in, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, so that is what I wanted to share with you all today. And I will turn it back over to Mark from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Liz. I think it's a very timely conversation, especially with all the uncertainty currently going on, both geopolitically as well as environment. So we'll transition into our Q&A session here with Liz. Liz, there are several questions here. You're welcome to take any that jump out at you. It could be from the top of the list here or any of these latest questions coming in, and I'll scroll down. But before we start with the formal Q&A, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your professional trajectory coming out of the MDP program, and how you took what you learned there, and how you went about identifying your own role in this world of sustainable development, specifically kind of the path you ended up following. So you talk a little bit about your experience in the MDP, and then how you grew after that experience.
Yeah, absolutely. The story that I tell about my path is that it was the feelings that I felt the first time I learned about extreme poverty that really set me on the path of sustainable development and social impact. I remember it very vividly. I was 20 years old, and I was sitting on campus at my college and reading an article actually from Professor Sachs. So there's kind of a full circle moment there, but about the state of extreme poverty, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa. And it was my first time really having my eyes opened to the reality of structural inequality. And there was this surge and wave of emotional energy that came over me. Up to this point, I had been on a path of psychology and neuroscience. I'd been shadowing psychiatrists in high school and low-key diagnosing different family members with personality disorders. No, just kidding. But that moment of really opening my eyes to the reality of inequality and injustice in the world, and that strong emotional response that I had set me on a path of social impact. I said, whoa, if I can channel this in some kind of way, I think I could be onto something. So from there, I went on to volunteer for a year outside of out of college, and I learned very quickly that I needed more technical skills. I needed more project management skills to really get done what I was seeking to get done. And then I found the MDP program, which was just a perfect fit for me. The idea of being a specialized generalist really resonated with me. And then the systems approach to it too also really resonated. During my time in the MDP program, I focused a lot on time banks, which are programs that use an alternative currency in the form of time to cultivate social capital development within communities. So a lot around informal economics. How do we measure? I started to really build up my toolkit around monitoring and evaluation around this, and in particular, kind of creative forms of monitoring and evaluation. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but questions of how do we measure economic development when no money is actually exchanged. So that was a big part of my research and the work that I did during grad school. And then right after grad school, I worked for Jeff in the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, so working on SDG policy. And it was really there that I began to see more and more, and I saw it throughout my training and throughout my years beforehand too, working in more grassroots development settings, just a gap in our field around tools and conversations around the inner dimension of this work. I was seeing a lot of colleagues and peers burning out, spinning out like the walk not matching the talk type of the things, a lot of intellectualization of suffering and tragedy. And so it was like a light bulb moment for me, and then a beautiful marriage and coming back together of different parts of my path and my interests to seek to fill that gap and begin building out the body of work that I call We Heal for All.
Great, that's so interesting. Thank you so much for sharing that. So yes, we can start at the top, or if there's another question that's jumping out at you, just let me know.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay.
Shall we go to Madagascar? Hi, Jean-Baptiste, would you like to read your question?
Yes. How are you? Yeah.
I'm so sorry. There's a little bit of an echo.
Yeah, Jean-Baptiste, we're getting a little bit of an echo today.
But go ahead. Maybe I can still make it through it. Go ahead and try. There's a bit of an echo, but I think we could try and make it work.
Yeah. People do not want to understand the vision or the objective or the priority of the government. So it's so difficult to talk about the long run or sustainable goals. So how government can get the acceptance of the population? That is my question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I'm going to read that. I believe it's this first top question here. Really, what I heard in the question is how to translate the vision of the government into ways that resonate with people, that people understand, that people feel maybe even inspired by or can see as being as the government seeking to achieve. Essentially, maybe like cultivating buy-in from local people and local communities, the government cultivating buy-in. Does that sound right as a question?
Yeah, I think you got it.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question, a big question. It makes me think of campaigns, public campaigns that governments have done, or that different large nonprofit organizations have done, that seeks to help to disseminate a message or disseminate a vision. I think it can be really challenging for a government to do this, especially when people don't see progress or are in a place of feeling disillusioned or despondent or really shut down by the circumstances. So I would imagine that it could be helpful to the government or to whoever is seeking to communicate a vision, really taking that reality into account and even speaking to that. Leaders really speaking to the reality of what people are experiencing on the ground, I think could take a step towards building trust. Thanks for that.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll turn next to Amber from Dublin. Amber, are you on the line with us? All right, let me go ahead and read the question for Amber. What structural or cultural changes are required within the UN system to fully embrace ecosystem leadership?
Yeah, it's a great question. Hopefully what I shared about the UN systems leadership framework, as well as the SDG Leadership Lab program, gave a little bit of a sense of this. The UN is a big beast. it's a big organization. So I get this image of a huge ship, and like steering a ship to move in a different direction. It takes a lot of time and there's a lot of moving parts involved. I think that, at least in my experience, the international development community, we're almost more comfortable with the structural stuff. I think it's tied to, you can't manage what you can't measure type of a thing. So more tangible results or structural change, that shows some kind of concrete outcome that, bodes well for funding streams and et cetera. But I think it's those cultural shifts. And what we found in the program, so again, I did M&E for this SDG Leadership Lab program, and there's a lot of limitations to being able to evaluate culture shifts and changes in internal shifts. And I'm happy to talk more about the tools that we did develop and the evaluation approach that we did ended up taking. But when we're really thinking about large scale culture change, we're thinking about secondary and even tertiary effects from a program. These programs took place over the course of 3 to 6 months, but really the true, and there was actually really interesting and great results in terms of the perceived change that participants had from the program, but how that then ripples out and impacts the ability to achieve different goals and get different projects done. That would take more of a longitudinal study, and is a different question to answer. Yeah, thanks for that question.
Okay, staying with Dublin, Stesha?
I'm happy to read it if that, unless Stesh is
Yeah, I
here.
think maybe we don't have Dublin on the line.
Oh, no, I think this is, so in light of the negativity around us, should we prioritize healing ourselves or eliminating that negativity first? As a leader, does this sequence change? This is an awesome question. And I wish we were in a workshop setting right now, because I think this would be a really cool and interesting prompt to generate some ideas around. The way that I personally see it is that these are two sides of the same coin, if you will. And I think even breaking down what we mean by negativity or eliminating negativity is also an interesting concept or an interesting idea. I think sometimes healing is thought about in a bit of a linear model of where it's like, oh, if I just meditate a bunch, then I won't feel anger. Oh, if I just, do A, B, and C, then I'm going to get the outcome of D, right? But there is another perspective that suffering and will always be part of the human condition and will always be part of our world. And I think it's an interesting point to ponder, especially in the times that we live in that are full of so much uncertainty and change. So the way that I frame it and talk about it is less about healing in order, the title of the book that I'm writing is around how to be in relationship with the world's pain. And it's not about doing certain things to no longer feel pain, because I honestly don't think that that's real or true or possible, but it's about equipping ourselves with the tools, with the capacities, with the ways of being that can shift our relationship with that pain and put us in a more empowered, healthy position within it. So yeah, I'll just pause there because again, we could talk about this all day and this would be a great workshop, a great workshop question. So thank you for it.
Great. Thank you. Julie Wright, are you on the line?
Yeah, hi, I'm Julie. I'm a junior at Lehigh. I'm studying community and global health. And I just want to see if you could elaborate on sort of the idea of collective trauma and how the consequences of that and unhealed collective trauma wounds can embed themselves in broader social systems and like the consequences of that.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a great question. It's a big question. And I think it requires us to start with a definition of what trauma is. We live at an exciting time where trauma is more in our zeitgeist and more in our collective conversations about what's going on in the world and what's going on in our communities. But I think sometimes we often lack a shared definition of it. So let's start there. So the definition that I work from in the strongest definition of collective trauma that I've come across, or trauma specifically, is that it is any time that something is too big, too fast, or happens too soon for a person to be able to process and integrate, right? So if something really tragic happens, if there is some kind of accident or some kind of harm that takes place for somebody and they don't have the bandwidth or the support or the tools within or outside of themselves to process that experience, instead their system, their mind, their body, their heart, their system becomes overwhelmed and resorts to really creative forms of protection, of self-protection within themselves to regain stability, right? So think about it, something awful happens, I don't have the tools to process it. So my system goes into, my nervous system goes into really creative forms of self-protection called defenses. that then push that overwhelm, push those unbearable feelings to the side in order for me to regain stability and keep moving forward in my life. That stuff that got pushed away, unless it's cared for, unless it's brought back to the forefront and a person has the tools and the resources that they need within and outside of themselves to process it, digest it, and integrate it, that then becomes trauma, right? That's what we call trauma. And emotions, what we've learned from these fields of psychology and neuroscience is that emotions are just energy. Emotions are energy in our mind and our body, and so energy cannot be created or destroyed, right? So by pushing it to the side, it doesn't mean it goes away. Instead, it lives in our unconscious or subconscious. So, and this is what can keep us stuck in patterns that perhaps were really helpful for us to get us through a time of dire need in order to keep moving, to survive, to get through it. But then these coping mechanisms, these creative self-protection defense strategies, once our environment and our circumstances are different, may actually be holding us back, could be keeping us stuck, and could actually lead to depression, to anxiety, to a disconnection with self and others. So these conversations about collective trauma are really interesting. And the way that I approach them is thinking about what can we take from what we know about our individual systems or trauma or healing at the individual level and apply it to the collective in order to make sense of some of the patterns or some of the phenomenon that we see in the world. And in the case of collective trauma, extrapolating from what I just shared there, we could see collective trauma, which could be historical trauma, right? It could be trauma that's related to historical events, wars, genocide, political coups, political upheaval, right, throughout history that leaves an impact or imprint on a people. Intergenerational trauma is another form of collective trauma that lives more within a family system or within a cultural system of families. If a group of people or a population doesn't have the tools that they need to be able to process that, then this collective trauma could get stuck within the system, stuck and can turn into and translate into culture, into cultural practices, into ways of working, ways of being. And then especially within social systems, in the way that if a crisis comes up, right, if there are these almost unconscious or subconscious patterns, defense mechanisms that are baked into the way that the leaders or the practitioners within that social system, and again, we're talking about culture here, we're talking about collective consciousness, and this is where it gets really interesting, because it could even be that maybe one or two people within that system, I'm thinking about like a nonprofit organization, for instance, a crisis comes up, how do we respond? And even if one or two people, want to respond in one way, there's often a cultural default mode within the organization that takes precedent, and so this is where I think these kind of co-creative tools, tools that bring people together to really look below the hood of the car, if you will, and examine the cultural makeup of an organization can become really helpful, like asking the question, why are we producing the collective outcomes that no one wants, right? And so looking below the hood of the car in a community setting can help to identify some of these stuck points that that can impact responses that might be tied to collective trauma. Or again, I want to, trauma is such a big word, but I really do want to point to like trauma being like it made sense at some point. You know what I mean? Like these kind of responses, this like coping mechanism or this creative protective defense mechanism was of service at some time, and now it's not any longer, or it may no longer be of service. So I know I just touched on a lot of different things. How did that land, Julie? Did I get close?
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for that question.
All right, back to Madagascar. Ninia?
Yeah, hello. I'm here and thank you for giving me the floor again. So I'm going to talk about popular vindictiveness, which is an antisocial phenomenon that occurs again in my country. So this is my question. So how to prevent this along its negative consequences, and how can community engage, improve trust in the legal system? So thank you for answering, Ms. Liz.
Thank you so much, Julie. Nini, I'm so sorry. Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a really interesting question, and it's a tough one too. It reminds me of Jean-Baptiste's question too, of where within the relationship or the cycle between what's happening on the ground and what's happening within institutions, are there opportunities to build more trust between institutions and between people? Yeah, perceived corruption or perceived injustice. I think that we could have a conversation about collective trauma within this as well, or just experiences of harm, experiences of injustice that are real for people in communities, you know, and how that then naturally leaves an imprint, right? Naturally affects the way that they then perceive the government or perceive institutions. So, you know, it makes me think of, in the US, there are community policing initiatives that seek to address the, you know, the adversarial or the challenged relationship between low-income communities, especially low-income Black and Brown communities in the US with police, just the history of state violence that communities have experienced through, or state violence might not be the right word, but just violent police brutality or experiences of injustice through or in relationship with the police system. And so community policing initiatives in the US have taken steps to build more coalitions between community leaders and the police force, really creating more like youth empowerment programs that help to rectify that distrust and rectify the history of ways, you know, ways that things went that actually weren't great, you know what I mean, and gave the community a really good reason to feel mistrust of the police. So that's an example of a program, or that's a program that comes to mind as an example of taking steps to really shift the relationship between an institution and a community.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Gary Smith, are you on the line?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Hi, Liz. Thank you for your presentation today. I'm currently studying sustainable development with University College Dublin. Would love to get your thoughts on how we could perhaps best measure the impact of inner development programs like the SDG Leadership Labs and leverage those insights in tandem with the UN Systems Leadership Framework you mentioned to better enhance overall talent management strategies. I'm thinking maybe the insights could help with more personalized coaching, or maybe help with capacity building initiatives, maybe better hiring or succession planning.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I think this is a really great question, and it was what I spent many long hours thinking about with the SDG Leadership Lab program, even just from an evaluation perspective for the USAID grant that we had. How do we communicate what happened within these labs, and how do we communicate, how do we assess if we were effective in doing what we hope to do? Perhaps you know, the thing that comes to mind to share is just a little bit more about how we personally did that. I think that we need more of these more of these evaluations and more like cross-pollinating and co-learning across evaluation systems that seek to do this or that are, designed to measure the impact of leadership development programs. I don't know of any like convenings or conferences that do that off the top of my head. I bet they are out there though. Maybe within the evaluation community, there is a subset. But yeah, we ended up for our program, we ended up developing a framework called the System Transformation Metric, and that was based on the Presencing Institute's method of theory U and the research that had been done and went into that method. So we looked at essentially 3 categories of capacities. We looked at systems thinking, then we looked at collaborative leadership, and then we looked at action learning. And then we defined out what skills made up those capacities. We had participants, the way that we did interviews at the beginning and then surveys at the end, because there's some limitations to being able to do a baseline survey at the beginning. In particular, for instance, one of the skills was listening skills. And, if we were to have done a baseline assessment through surveys at the beginning that said, because we use a Likert scale of rating self-assessment and rating a person from rating themselves from 1 to 5. And so if we would have done a survey for the baseline assessment and asked, rate yourself, how good are you at listening, right? Take a second to self-reflect, how good are you at listening, before they actually went through the module that teaches them about what we mean by listening, the specific dimensions of listening or ways of listening that we're talking about and teaching within this training program. They could at the beginning be like, I'm great at 4 out of 5, I'm great at listening. Then go through the program and be like, oh, that's what they mean by listening. Then at the end, rate themselves again and be like, actually, I'm more like a 2 at listening. I have a lot of work to do, which then would have made the comparative analysis at the end of looking baseline to endline survey confusing. So that's just one example of some of the limitations or the interesting design challenges around measuring the impact of these kind of programs. But more generally to your question, I think it'd be great if more of us came together and swapped stories and shared learnings.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Gary, for your question, and thank you, Liz, for your response. We are out of time. We could talk so much more about a lot of these things. Thank you, Liz, for bringing this new topic to us in the global classroom. I think it was very well received and very, very much needed. So thank you for doing that.
It is absolutely my pleasure. Thank you all so much for having me, and it's nice to meet you. Please feel free to reach out if you'd like to connect. So thanks.
Yes, thank you so much. And as a final reminder, everybody, we will not be meeting next Tuesday as we have off for Election Day here in the US. So we'll return again in 2 weeks. And if you are not switching your daylight savings time in that time period, you might have to sign on at a different time. And we'll send all those details out in the next email. But thank you all for joining us. Have a happy local time. Please vote if you're able to do so wherever you are. And we look forward to seeing you in a couple of weeks. Thank you, everybody. Have a great weekend.